pleasure to introduce to you Robert Bernasconi, who has come from Penn State in the snowstorm. I won't introduce him as fully as he deserves, but Robert now teaches in philosophy at Penn State. He taught before that in Memphis, and before that in the UK. I forget where. Essex. He's written two really excellent books on Heidegger, mostly on questions of language and questions of questions in Heidegger. And then recently, 2 or 3 years ago, a really nice book called How to Read Sartre. He's also written about 1 million articles and on an amazing array of thinkers. Why don't you guys come up, rather than crowding out of the door, come up and sit on the stage.
There's over here.
And there's some space over here, some floor space over here. He's written on Arendt, on W.E.B. Du Bois, on Aimé Césaire, on most of the Western philosophical canon, from the beginning through Hegel and up to Legitimizing Derrida. But most recently, I guess recently now extends for 15 or 20 years, he's been working on the question of race and philosophy. Race in philosophy and race and philosophy, both at a philosophical and theoretical level, which is what he'll speak to us tonight about, also at a very practical level, and has an extraordinary program, had at Memphis and has at Penn State, an extraordinary program which recruits and mentors African-American PhD candidates in philosophy. This is a much needed, sadly, much needed enterprise, and it's really fabulous, I think, doing it. So, welcome, thanks for coming.
It's really ridiculous that so many of you came out on a night like this. I feel so embarrassed. If I could only have told you not to come, there should have been a way. But anyway, thank you for coming this evening. And I'm sorry, I've got a little bit of a cold, and so I'm not quite myself, and it may interrupt me from time to time, but bear with me. Historians tell us, and I'm persuaded, that we live in a world that was made by the Atlantic slave trade. It determined the distribution of wealth and power that is still with us today and literally decimated Africa. Historians have told us a lot about the facts of slavery, the laws under which the slaves lived in North America, in the Caribbean, in South America, the conditions under which they came here. But there has not been sufficient attention by historians of ideas, still less historians of philosophy, to how this system was put in place, how they explained to themselves, these white folks, what they were doing. In fact, it's an absolute scandal, in my view, that if you look at any history of political philosophy, you will find barely a word on slavery. All the books tell you about freedom, but they forget to tell you the other side. I don't accept until recently, where there have been a couple of controversies which are in the background of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll just allude to those controversies now. They're controversies that, to a certain extent, I've instigated, and I've received a lot of opposition mainly from non-philosophers, mainly sort of people like political theorists, because philosophers don't really care. But basically, I've been arguing that both John Locke and Immanuel Kant are deeply implicated in the slave trade in ways that it is ridiculous that we ignore. Perhaps you already know this because I know you have a remarkable faculty here at Bard College. But John Locke invested in the slave trade. He made money from investing in the slave trade. I'll tell you some worse things about him in a second. But he also, at the end of his life, he was one of the few people in England who really knew what was happening in slavery because he was on the Board of Trade. So he knew what was going on, but did not raise his voice against it. And in fact, as I'll mention, he helped to legitimate it. And Immanuel Kant, who's supposed to be one of the good guys, never published a word against the slave trade, even though it was one of the dominant issues of his day. Even though in the Metaphysics of Morals he expresses himself against slavery, but we know that in his lectures he promoted the idea that Africans should be enslaved because they were fit for nothing else. That was Kant's view. And yet you have these people today who still celebrate the memories of Locke and Kant in philosophy as the pinnacle of the canon of the Western philosophical tradition. It makes me angry, but that's not where I'm going right now. We tell stories to ourselves about, for example, the success of the Enlightenment. There's, I think, a tendency to want to give credit to the philosophy of the Enlightenment for the abolition of the slave trade. But of course we now know, now that we sort of really look at it, that in fact the philosophers of the Enlightenment, at least the ones who are said to be most representative of it, were supportive of it. Abolitionism came more from as a religious movement. Arguably, the philosophers had the resources, but they didn't employ them. It's hard to think of a major canonical philosopher who had anything bad to say about the slave trade. And of course, in some ways that's not surprising because the canon was formed at a time when nobody was sensitive to that issue. And I don't, for the life of me, understand why, now that we see the bigger picture, now that we can say we care, now that we can say we are inheriting a world which gave us all these problems because they promoted slavery and the slave trade, and what I'm interested in here this evening, the ideology necessary to legitimate slavery after the fact. Now we know that we need to, I think, rethink how philosophy is supposed to be applied to practical issues. I see so many of the mistakes that I think philosophers are indulging in today as they talk about issues of climate control. They're the same kind of mistakes that I think they made 200 years ago talking about chattel slavery. Now, one of the reasons why historians of philosophy have so little to say about this is because they actually know very little history. I apologize if there are historians of philosophy in the house, but I'm not talking about you. Everybody else but you. And this is because there are so many myths that surround the notion of race. The idea that everybody until 1950 was a racial essentialist or something of that nature. is nonsensical. The idea that during slavery times the one-drop rule was in effect. But you perhaps already know that those are myths. But what fewer people appreciate is that the association of slavery with race, specifically being African, is actually a lot more tenuous than people think. Being black was clearly not a sufficient condition for being a slave, as there were many free black people in the Americas during this time. There were many, there were some people from Africa right at the beginning of the colonization of North America who were free. But it's important also to recognize that it was not a necessary condition for being a slave. How many of you, I wonder, know that Sally Hemings's daughter by Thomas Jefferson, her son, Eston Hemings, when he was freed, counted as white. He was a slave, then after being freed, he was white. And Jefferson explained all this in a letter to a friend of his, Richard Gray, who had come from the north, from Massachusetts, and was trying to explain why are there so many slaves who look white? And the answer was because legally they were white. And that is because the rule for racial identification at that time in Virginia was that to count as black, you had to be 1/8 of black. You had to be 1/8 of black heritage. That's right. That was during the 18th century. But then, beginning around about 1784, I believe, and then reaffirmed in 1822, you had to be 1/4 black to count as black. And that's why Eston Hemings was not considered black by the census. Although his brother, who had the same parentage, and therefore should also have counted as white, was in that same census counted as black because he looked more black. And then you have to think about how, as you moved from state to state, not just from decade to decade, your racial identity changed because different states had different fractions. That's how far away they were from this racial essentialism that we tend to attribute to them, but also how far they were away from the one-drop rule, which in fact was only introduced in the second decade of the 20th century, and in Virginia in 1924. And I make this point because if we're trying to understand the history of slavery, and I'm trying to understand the history of slavery because I'm trying to understand the American idea of race, with which it's completely interlinked. We need to understand, we need to know that what determined one's condition as a slave was not the color of your skin, your racial identification, as it was understood at that time, but what social status your mother had. Slavery was passed on from generation to generation through the matrilineal line. That was the legal definition. And up until 1804, it was the task of the slave holder to establish that the person concerned was a slave. It was only in 1804 that the presumption, the legal presumption, was that if you were black, you had to prove that you weren't a slave. So that was an important change, a late change. Why did it come so late? How was race functioning in the creation of this system of slavery that we think of retrospectively in terms of race? What does it mean for our understanding of race? So how was slavery understood at the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, if not in terms of race? Well, I'm interested in this question not because I'm thinking that if the white people had suddenly realized that there was no justification for enslaving these people, they would have suddenly freed them. But because I believe that it was the attempt to legitimate slavery after the fact, when they had seen the crime they had committed. And many of the founding fathers are very explicit about this. Remember Jefferson's formula, you know, I tremble that God is just. Right? Because they're aware of this, they had to provide an ideology and indeed a science which would legitimate, in some sense, what they had done, and then in the name of that ideology and that science, of course, new crimes were subsequently committed. So, when this system was being put in place in the 17th century, when the expansion of the slave trade with Africa was being put in place, there was no racial ideology as such to appeal to it. I'm going to qualify that in a minute, in an important way, but just recognizing that, giving me that for the minute before I qualify it. What were the resources they had at their disposal to think about what they were doing? The first use of the word race in the roughly the sense in which we use it today, to talk about divisions amongst human beings, was on the 22nd of April 1684, when Francois Bernier wrote an essay on new divisions of the earth, according to species or races. He was using the term species or race as equivalent, but of course species was not yet a technical term any more than race was. They understood they could divide the world into what they would call Negroes, whites, the Native Americans, Laplanders, whom they thought of as completely apart. But they didn't see it the way we see it. For example, people in the subcontinent of India were counted as white in 1684, and Bernier had spent over 10 years in India. So he wasn't speaking out of ignorance, but he saw the Indians as white. It's later that, 100 years later, that they decided that people from India were not white. But this sense of a difference between people was not what they appealed to. That was not what they, for the most part, turned to when they were trying to explain to themselves what it was that they were doing. The resources that they were applying was the distinction between Christians and heathens, first of all. And that was because there was a convention at that time, it had been in place for a significant amount of time, that Christians did not enslave their fellow Christians. And that was going to be truly important for trying to come to an understanding of what they were doing and how they had to understand it. At that time, they had a distinction between free men and servants. But they didn't yet have a distinction between slaves and indentured servants. That was a distinction which would slowly develop during the 17th century, but right at the beginning there wasn't a distinction. Indeed, it was, when you're reading texts in Latin, it's very hard to decide whether you should translate it as slave or servant. And of course there was a distinction between men and women. And you should never forget that race is always about sex. It's much more about sex than it's about classification. The obsession with race in the United States is an obsession with race mixing, at least it has been historically. And in fact, most of the first laws that were established which involved a reference specifically to Negroes and whites as different were not laws about slavery at all, because that was all done in terms of the mother. They were laws about who you could have sex with. It was all about the policing of race mixing. So people talk today a lot about intersectionality. It's a sort of cult word in academia, you've probably heard it. In other words, that you shouldn't look, it's as I understand it, it's an ethical imperative that you should, that not social studies people understand it differently, but you should not isolate race or gender or class or religion and focus on one of those at the expense of the others. But what you see when you look at this situation, that before the notion of race is working in an ideological way, that all these other factors are at play, and that race emerges out of their conjunction into their relation with each other. But it's time I backed up a minute and acknowledged that even though I said that slavery was not justified in terms of race, there are some notable exceptions to that we have to think about. And what I want to do here is make a distinction between thinking, appealing to what we retrospectively would call racial divisions, and a racial ideology as such. So just to give you an example, I'm going to give you 2 or 3 examples of how a certain prejudice against Africans, against blacks, was already functioning in the 17th century in important ways. Let me reference, for example, Paul Baines. He died in 1615, and his entire commentary on the whole of St. Paul's epistle to the Ephesians was published posthumously. And in this text, he writes, he's commenting on chapter 6, verse 5, the one which says, servants must be obedient to their masters. And he says, well, there are 2 kinds of servants. There are those who are the more slavish, and those who are the more free and liberal. Notice how he doesn't have a clear distinction between slave and servant, indentured servant, perhaps, there. It's a matter of simply degree. And then, trying to illustrate the first of these, he says, the first are those whose bodies are perpetually put under the power of the master as blackamoors with us. So there is a reference here. Again, it's not exactly clear how you should best understand this. Is he saying that it is because they are blackamoors that their bodies are put under us? Or is he just saying there are some people whose bodies are put under us, and for us white English people, he was writing in Cambridge, England, blackamoors were the example. In any case, when he tries to explain why the blackamoors are more slavish, he does not refer to anything like race. He gives three fundamental justifications. One is that slavery is a voluntary relation. If you were poor, you could contract to be a servant or slave, again, this is not distinguished at the time, in return for being looked after. Secondly, he says, you could have been forcibly captured. This was one of the main components that I keep referring back to, that prisoners captured in a just war, it was believed, could legitimately be enslaved. But the general idea was that you had them in chains, and you would say to them, look, I'm going to keep you in chains, or you're going to contract with me to work in return for me taking the chains off, and in return, I will look after you. So, for both of those, it's a contractual relationship. And then he says there are natural slaves, by which he means servants who are born the slaves of the masters. In other words, slavery as an inherited relation. So that's how, at the beginning of the 17th century, someone is thinking of how you justify slavery, how the system is going to take place. And race is playing what we call race, playing only a very minor role. By the end of the century, 1684, Thomas Tryon writes a text called The Negro's Complaint, which he writes, it was a convention at the time, a number of people did this, he puts the words into the mouth of an African slave. And this is part of his book, Friendly Advice to the Gentlemen Planters of the East and West Indies. And what he has this black slave say is, the black slave addressing a white planter, it is perhaps, you will say, that not by virtue of your religion, but by some super excellent or higher dignity of nature above us, you claim a right to make us your slaves and vassals. So he puts out the argument there, that there is a racial hierarchy, perhaps, but then the text knocks it down very rapidly. It says, well, what would be the source of this racial hierarchy? It can't be from descent, because we all believe in monogenesis. And so we all come from the same source. It can't be from physical strength, because in fact, the black slaves are stronger than the white people. As he puts it, we run faster, jump higher, swim better than the white folks. And then he goes on and says, and intellectually, we're the equals as well. Now, what's significant about this text is that he seems to be arguing against somebody who might be saying that there is a racial hierarchy. But the fact of the matter is, it's very hard to find examples of people actually making that claim at that time. And indeed, one of the curiosity is that throughout the 17th and 18th century, it seems you have more abolitionist texts which suggest that there were arguments at the time about race than you can find any pro-slavery writings that seem to refer to race. In fact, most of the people arguing in favour of slavery during that time period are saying race has got nothing to do with it. Certainly not racial hierarchy. The reason we have slaves is because they were captured in a just war. And that, since the beginning of time, since the ancients has been a legitimate form of slavery. And you have to remember that up until fairly well into the 18th century, you almost never find anyone who will argue against slavery as an institution as such. People might say, well, slaves should not be treated this way, or that one form of slavery is bad. But slavery as an institution was accepted. And it was only because the slavery became so extreme, so cruel, so vicious, so violent, that the sensibilities of people were affected and they began to argue in favor of abolition. Now it's also true, and what I'm trying to do is show how complicated this is, that we can't have any simple understanding of how race and slavery is linked. Is that if you look at Samuel Sewall's text, The Selling of Joseph, which appeared in 1700, he gives 4 justifications of slavery. One is this prisoners caught in a just war. The second is you can Christianize or civilize the slaves. The third is the curse of Ham, and the fourth is that Abraham had slaves. So you see a variety of arguments. One of them is the so-called curse of Ham that was still functioning as an argument in the Rwandan genocide. So it's a sort of long-standing story. But when Samuel Sewall said none of those arguments justify what we're doing to Africans at this moment, one of the few people really to come out and say that, he immediately solicited a reply from John Saffron, who says, well, those arguments about slaves caught in a just war, that's a good argument. Civilizing slaves, that's a good argument. But I don't believe any of this curse of Ham, and the Bible is not relevant here. So that, again, even the defenders of slavery are not putting forward a stereotypical racial ideology to explain what's going on. It is true that there were some people, a few, who believed in polygenesis. That is to say, they believed that we were not all descended from Adam, that there were a number of local creations, as they were called, and that therefore the races were, in effect, what we call the races were in effect what we would call different species. But that doesn't seem to have been a very widespread argument. There's some evidence for it before 1700, but it doesn't become a widespread argument until the end of the 18th century, when it's proposed by Voltaire, by Henry Hume Lord Keynes, and by Georg Forster. And it seems to be more an intellectual argument, because for the most part people were happy to believe in monogenesis, because that conformed to the biblical account. So, what happened? Did anything happen? Was it just a gradual flow? The standard account that goes back to Jordan, the author of White and Black, or Edmund Morgan, whose famous essay Slavery and Freedom must be about 30 years old or more now, is that no decision was made. But if there was a decision, if there was a moment, it seems to me that it comes in 1669 with the Fundamental Constitution of Carolina, where Article 101 read, "Every free man of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves of what religion or opinion soever." Now what that means, first of all, is that even if you baptize your slaves, they're still going to be slaves. So that the convention that you have to free your Christian slaves doesn't count for black people. In other words, black people are perpetually heathen, even though they've been baptized, for the purpose of the convention. And this was because the planters and the missionaries were in conflict, and it was a kind of compromise they came up with. Now this is a compromise they came up with in a lot of different colonies. But Carolina was unique in formulating it in the way that I said. Every free man of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves, which means, first of all, the slaves are, in this article, identified as specifically Negro. Oh my goodness, it's getting over. Okay. Hold on to your handbags. So, I've lost the train of thought. So that this, the basic idea about religion was widespread. But what is different is that the free men of Carolina, by this article, put the slave under a perpetual death sentence. To have absolute power and authority, in the parlance of the time, was to say, you can kill your slave for no reason at all. Simply because that is your slave. That's what it means. All slaves existed under the death sentence. Now, where does this idea come from? It comes from John Locke. John Locke was secretary of the Lords Proprietors of Carolina when this was written. And indeed, if you go to the New York Public Library, you can see the copy of the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, which John Locke revised in January 1682. And while he changed a lot of things, he left that clause intact. So Locke, who wrote, slavery is so vile and miserable in the state of man, and so opposite to the generous temper and courage of our nation that is scarcely to be imagined that an Englishman, let alone a gentleman, should plead for it. That's the beginning of the first treatise. Locke comes out, it seems, against slavery, and so everybody is saying, oh, Locke, you know, George Bush and Tony Blair, when they got together a few years back in London, celebrated Locke as what the British and the Americans had in common. Yeah, that is what we have in common, and we should be ashamed of it. We should be ashamed of it. Because if you then read the second treatise, you can see that Locke, for the first time in history, defines slavery. And he's writing it in 1682, the same time as he's revising the Fundamental Constitutions. He actually says, the slave has forfeited his own life by some act that deserves death. And if the slave doesn't like the way they're being treated, well, the slave has an option. They can disobey the master and allow the master to kill them. That's the only way out. That's Locke. Now, some people tell me, oh, you know, when he was writing the second treatise, Carolina was out of sight and out of mind. That's the argument. But it's the same year. It's the same time. Now, it is true that Locke was against hereditary slavery. So that's the difference between the system of slavery he was putting in force in Carolina. And he actually believed that you couldn't have voluntary slavery. But in some ways it was because he believed those things that he could give the most vigorous and vicious definition of slavery that had ever been provided up until that time. If you look at Grotius, if you look at Pufendorf, if you look at James Tyrrell, you will see a completely different view. James Tyrrell was writing his book, Patriarcha Monarcha, which was published in 1681, at the same time in the same house as Locke was writing the Two Treatises of Government. And what Tyrrell says is that no sober planter in Barbados. I don't think there were many sober planters in Barbados, because they were making rum. But anyway, he does say, no sober planter in Barbados, who are most of them assignees of slaves taken in war, in other words, back to the justification of slavery, being captives taken in the just war, the same one as Locke uses in the second treatise. No sober planter in Barbados will grant a slave may lawfully run away if that slave is denied what he calls liberty and enjoyment of the ordinary comforts of life. That is the distance between Tyrrell and Locke. Locke believes that slaves have no rights. Tyrrell actually believes the slave has a right to kill the master if the master mistreats him or her and he or she can't run away. That's the difference. So I want to know why we celebrate Locke, but I also want to know how, from this starting point, race became such a decisive factor in the way slavery became theorized. I can see I have time issues. So let me jump ahead a little bit and mention Mr. Kant. We've seen that slavery is defined as a hereditary condition. Right? Once a slave, you inherit being a slave through the mother. Now, for most of the 18th century, skin color was not seen as a hereditary factor. It was environmentally caused. Buffon, the leading natural historian of his day, said if you take some families from the Senegal and move them to Denmark and let them, he said build a wall around them, which seems a bit mean, but anyway, build a wall around them and wait 6 generations, open the door, they will come out white. And this was a widespread view at the time. Why? Because they had no explanation of how, beginning from monogenesis, the idea we're all descended from the same human pair, you could get hereditary permanent differences. So who solved the problem and made it possible for people to believe that race was hereditary, like slavery? Well, of course, it was Kant. Kant had some weird theories about race, but he explained that, and he's doing it to argue against polygenesis, the polygenesis of Voltaire and Keynes I mentioned too earlier. But in effect, what he justifies is a system of permanent racial differences, which, needless to say, he hierarchized. You know, all the usual stereotypes were in place, except for white people who he says have all the talents. Nobody else has all the talents. Everybody else has these defects, according to Kant. And while he doesn't seem to link his theory of race explicitly to his theory of slavery in any grand way, it is there, clearly by implication, and eventually people take up the link. And early in the 19th century, slavery is racialized. It's racialized after the fact. There's a debate that's been going on. I'm going to wrap this up. Is that about, I'm supposed to wrap it up by now? Right. I'll wrap it up. Fixing to close, as I say. debate has been going on for some time. Did slavery produce racism, as Eric Williams, former Prime Minister of Trinidad, argued, or did racism produce slavery? And what I've been arguing for today is a more complex relation between the two, because there is a kind of latent racism, a kind of racial prejudice that one sees with these references to the curse of Ham, reference to the blackamoors, which is not a theoretical racism. It's not a racial ideology, but it's what I like to call a proto-racism. The term proto-racism is used by other people to mean other things, but I'm using it to say that racism, a racism without races, a racism prior to race as Kant thought it, that nevertheless produced the system which made it necessary for people to embrace this weird idea of race and link it to slavery to justify what they had done. Now, of course, the idea of race, as we saw, did not map on to slavery. That was the point of my reference to Eston Hemmings at the beginning. It never made a whole lot of sense. But it was sufficient to comfort their consciences. And then it gave birth to a new set of crimes under the name of colonialism, which does fit much better these ideas of racial hierarchy and racial difference that were originally introduced and invented in order to justify this extraordinary genocide, this extraordinary system of chattel slavery, about which we have still not learned to be honest. Let's just fast forward for 1 minute, just 1 minute here, before I close. People today, and have been doing this since the UNESCO Statement of Race in 1950, are going to tell you that racism is discriminating against people on the basis of a biological idea of race. The biologists have no use for this idea of race. Racism is thus an epistemological error. It's a mistake. It was just bad science. Oh dear, never mind. Now we see we made the mistake. Everything can be all right. That is the way, this has been the way since the end of the Second World War. The white people, yes, white people, have tried to deal with this heritage, tried to deal with this unjust distribution of resources in the world and in our country, in our neighborhoods, in our healthcare system. It was just a mistake. But it wasn't just a mistake. It was evil. It was greed. It was the profit motive. It was the belief that even though the logic didn't work, even though there really was no solid justification for what they were doing, it didn't really matter. That's why they did it, and hardly a single voice was voiced against it except for a few Quakers until the abolitionist movement really got going in the 1770s, but then it was all too late. That's a heritage we live with. That's what we have to understand when we try and think about race in this country and globally. What we have to think about when we think about the after effects of this system of chattel slavery, the after effects of colonialism, which is by no means over even today. And until we face this squarely, until it becomes part of our philosophy textbooks, part of our moral discourse, we ourselves, in my view, remain culpable. Thank you very much.